On December 18th, 1994, in the middle of the night, 27-year-old Alison Botha had just witnessed her attackers driving away, leaving her for dead after a vicious attack. She may have considered just lying there and waiting for the inevitable to happen, but she chose not to after suffering 37 stab wounds to her abdomen and 17 to her neck. Instead, she tucked them in as best she could, using a shirt to hold them in place, realizing there was a huge hole in her abdomen where her intestines were leaking out. Then she somehow managed to get to her feet to search and hope for help. But then, as soon as she stood up, her head started to tilt backward, and she saw that her eyesight was becoming blurry. She put her head to her neck and realized that she had almost been decapitated, which was the reason why her head was shifting. She would have had to walk with her intestines supported by her other hand and her head held firmly in place with the other. In an attempt to spot an angel passing by, she is moving in the direction of the headlights that indicate a nearby highway. What happened on that night? And how did this unassuming 27-year-old woman pull off a miracle no one saw coming? Born on September 22nd, 1967, Alison Botha was the definition of a run-of-the-mill child. See, her parents divorced when she was just 10, causing her to spend most of her life growing up with her mother and brother, the two individuals who would have the most influence on who she would grow up to be. She attended the Collegiate High School for Girls in Port Elizabeth, and did so well that she even served as the head girl at the school. After she finished school, Alison would spend some time traveling around, and then finally come back home to a job as an insurance broker, a job she absolutely loved. Basically, Alison was living a version of the dream, creating a story for herself. However, her story would soon take an unexpected turn, as the universe had something more gruesome for her than anyone could have ever expected. On December 18th, 1994, Alison had perhaps the best day possible, as she spent the day at the beach with her friends, and after a day of games and laughter, she brought them home for pizza and ice cream. They went without a hitch, and by the end of the day, when most of her friends had gone home, Alison was left with the task of driving the last friend home. She had no problem, and a few minutes later she was on her way home. Sadly, she would never make it home, and a nightmare like no other began. Around 1 a.m. that Sunday, Alison got home to meet her usual parking spot. Not being one to like confrontation, Alison decided to drive a little further to park her car. Sadly, this would be an extremely bad decision. After driving for a while, Alison finally found a place to park, but something about this spot was terribly wrong. At the spot, a tree blocked the streetlight, covering her car in darkness. The spot was isolated, and worst of all, she wasn't the only one, as someone was watching her from the shadows. Tucked safely in the comfort of her car, Alison reached to the back of her car to grab her fresh laundry, but sadly, one of her habits came to bite her as she sat in the car. See, she had a bad habit of not locking her car, and sadly, that night she didn't. A few seconds after reaching for her back seat, Alison was quickly washed by the warm night wind and the cold, sharp, pointy end of a knife. Frozen in fear, Alison was pulled back to reality as the attacker asked her to move over or be killed. Still fear-stricken, Alison did as she was told and moved over. The driver soon entered the car and sped off, saying he had no intention of hurting Alison. Sadly, she believed him, and even worse, he lied. As the man sped down the road, he began making small talk with Alison and even introduced himself as Clinton, claiming he only wanted to borrow her car for an hour. As the two traveled on, Alison deeply considered jumping out of the car and running to find help. However, she stayed put, and soon enough the car pulled over, and another man stepped into the car. It was now that she began to fear the worst, but sadly, it was too late, as the two drove her out of town and into a remote and secluded area just outside the city. Upon reaching the area, the two men stopped the car and told Alison they were going to have sex with her, asking her if she was going to fight or not. Cornered and terrified, Alison said no and watched as the horror unfolded. Driven by lust, the two men proceeded to rape her, and when they were done, they choked her until she passed out. Not satisfied with their brutality, the men stabbed Alison 35 times in the abdomen, hoping for her to die from her wounds. Contrary to his thoughts, however, Alison did not die, but rather began to gain consciousness again. Noticing her leg twitch, Clinton's friend decided the job wasn't done and slit her throat 16 times, damaging her voice box and leaving her to bleed out. As the men finally stepped back, Botha heard them admiring their work and speaking in Afrikaans. "Do you think she's dead?" one of the attackers asked. "No one can survive that," the other replied. But miraculously, Alison did, and she was determined to get her vengeance. Crawling across the ground, Alison watched as the two men threw her laundry to the floor and sped off. As they sped off, Alison quickly grabbed a denim jacket and used it to hold up her organs, which now hung out of her abdomen. Even more surprisingly, Alison heard her attackers talk before leaving, and even heard them call each other by their real names. Consumed by adrenaline, she wrote their names on the earth, Franz and Kruger. After writing this, she wrote, "I love you, Mom," and began to have an out-of-body experience. There, she was faced with either making peace with her death or continuing to survive. She chose to survive, and what happened next shocked everyone. Realizing she wasn't getting anywhere quickly by crawling, she decided to muster up her strength to stand. But what happened next shocked doctors worldwide. See, her attackers had done such a thorough job that her head now hung by a few muscles from her head. To make matters worse, her voice box was torn and she was breathing. A cut near her collarbone meant she could hear every breath. But once again, against all odds, she made it to the road with one hand holding her organs and one holding her head. On the road, the first car to pass by sped up as it saw her and left her hopes dying. However, the second stopped and called for an ambulance. Although the hospital was just 20 minutes away, the ambulance took an hour to arrive, and Alison was so close to death. At the hospital, doctors realized her case was like no other, as dirt hung from her organs and her head was almost severed. But that night, the doctors pulled a miracle of their own, and Alison recovered. But that was not all, as she remembered her attackers. As she recovered, Alison was faced with a list of suspects from the police to identify her attackers, wasting no time in identifying Franz du Toit and Tens Kruger, who apparently had previously been held for 2 rape charges and even had suspicions of practicing Satanism. Now, breathing through a tube, Alison had to make a verbal claim about her attack, and against the wishes of her doctors, she pulled out her tubes and made the verbal claim, leading to the arrest of the 2 attackers. In the end, Franz du Toit and Tens Kruger were charged with the case and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1995. However, the 2 were later released on parole on July 4th, 2023, after 28 years in prison. Their release was, however, extremely controversial, as women nationwide criticized the release. Today, Alison is a human rights activist, using her story to uplift and enlighten people worldwide. As an established writer, Alison's journey wasn't an easy one, as she fought depression and struggled to find a new job. In the end, the horror of life became her strongest tool, which she used to change the world. But what do you think? Should they still be in prison, or was their release a good decision? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and if you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe.